It is the early morning of April the 12th, 1862, in the small Georgia town of Big Shanty. A Confederate mail and supply train called the General has stopped here, as it does every morning, so that its passengers and crew can step off for breakfast. Among the men still seated aboard the train are more than 20 Union soldiers, dressed as civilians, who did not come to Georgia to eat breakfast. Within minutes, they will uncouple the passenger cars, take the locomotive, and run it north, beginning one of the strangest and most consequential railroad chases in American military history. One of the men on that train is a 19-year-old private from Ohio named Jacob Parrott. He does not know it yet, but the events of the next several days will make him, before the year is out, the answer to a question no American soldier had ever been asked before. Who receives the very first Medal of Honor? Jacob Wilson Parrott was born on July the 17th, 1843, in Fairfield County, Ohio. The historical record on his early life is thin, as it is for most enlisted men of his era. He was a young man from rural Ohio, with no particular claim to distinction before the war. In 1861, at around the age of 18, he enlisted as a private in Company K of the 33rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. His first combat came at the Battle of Ivy Mountain in Kentucky, a minor engagement compared to what awaited him a few months later. By early 1862, Parrott was serving in Tennessee and northern Georgia as part of the Union Army's push into the Confederate heartland, which is where he was selected, along with roughly 20 other soldiers, for a secret mission, whose full danger none of them could have fully appreciated in advance. The raid did not happen in isolation. Less than a week earlier, on April 6th and 7th, the Union and Confederate armies had fought the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, one of the bloodiest engagements of the war to that point, with more than 20,000 men killed, wounded, or missing combined. The Western theater of the war was, in other words, already in the middle of some of its costliest fighting when this smaller, stranger operation was set into motion. By the spring of 1862, the Union's Army of the Ohio, under General Ormsby Mitchell, was advancing into northern Alabama and Georgia. One of the Confederacy's key advantages in the Western theater was its rail network, in particular the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which connected Atlanta to Chattanooga and served as a critical supply artery. If that line could be cut, its bridges burned, its track torn up, Confederate reinforcement and resupply through the region would be badly disrupted, potentially opening the way for a faster Union advance on Chattanooga. The plan to make that happen was the idea of a civilian scout and spy named James J. Andrews, operating with the Union Army's authorization. Andrews recruited a small group of Union soldiers, mostly from Ohio infantry regiments, to travel in disguise deep into Confederate Georgia, seize a train, and run it north while destroying track and bridges as they went. It was, by any measure, a mission with a low margin for error. 20-some men, in enemy uniforms they weren't wearing, roughly 200 miles inside Confederate territory, with no realistic plan for retreat if anything went wrong. On the morning of April 12th, Andrews and his men boarded the General as ordinary passengers. When the train stopped at Big Shanty for the standard breakfast stop, the raiders acted. While the train's crew and most of its passengers were off eating, the raiders uncoupled the passenger cars, boarded the locomotive and a few freight cars, and set off north, toward Chattanooga, and toward the bridges they intended to burn behind them. What followed became known as the Great Locomotive Chase. The General's conductor, William Fuller, immediately gave chase, first on foot, then by handcar, and eventually by commandeering other locomotives to pursue the raiders up the line. The chase covered roughly 87 miles of track, passing through Moon Station, Etowah, Kingston, and Adairsville before reaching Resaca, where a long trestle over the Ostenala River was one of the raiders' prime targets for destruction. Because it had been raining for days, the wood the raiders tried to burn was too wet to catch fire quickly, and at Tunnel Hill, just short of the Georgia-Tennessee line, they were unable to damage the tunnel at all. The pursuit closed the distance faster than Andrews' men could put real distance between themselves and their pursuers. After a chase of roughly 87 miles, the general finally ran out of fuel and wood north of Ringgold, Georgia. The raiders abandoned the train and scattered into the countryside on foot. Nearly all of them, including Parrott, were captured within days. As prisoners, the raiders were in an unusually precarious position. Because they had operated out of uniform, behind enemy lines, Confederate authorities considered treating them not as prisoners of war, but as spies, a distinction that could mean execution rather than exchange. That is exactly what happened to several of them. 8 of the raiders, including Andrews himself, were tried and hanged as spies in Atlanta. Andrews on June 7th, and 7 others, 6 soldiers and 1 civilian, together on June 18, 1862. Parrott, along with several other captured raiders, was held separately and interrogated. The historical record is direct on this point, and there's no need to embellish it. Accounts describe Parrott being beaten repeatedly by his captors in an effort to force him to give up additional information about the raid and its planning. He did not do so. Weeks after those executions, on July 12, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed legislation formally creating the Army Medal of Honor. At the moment of the raid itself, back in April, this decoration did not yet exist. It would be this newly created award, not even a year old, that Secretary of War Edwin Stanton presented to Parrott the following spring. Parrott and several other surviving raiders were eventually part of a prisoner exchange and returned to Union lines. From there, he was brought to Washington, D.C., where, along with several other survivors of the raid, he met President Lincoln and Secretary Stanton. It was Stanton who presented Parrott with the nation's first Medal of Honor on March 25, 1863, not because his individual actions during the raid were singled out above the other raiders, but because of the order in which the medals were presented that day, and the ordeal he had endured as a prisoner. History remembers him, by simple accident of that ceremony's order, as recipient number 1. The medals awarded to Parrott and the other Andrews raiders used identical citation language, which reads, in full, one of the 19 of 22 men, including 2 civilians, who, by direction of General Mitchell, or Buell, penetrated nearly 200 miles south into enemy territory and captured a railroad train at Big Shanty, Georgia, in an attempt to destroy the bridges and tracks between Chattanooga and Atlanta. It's worth noting, in the interest of historical honesty, that even the official citation carries a small piece of uncertainty in its own wording. The parenthetical naming both Mitchell and Buell reflects some contemporary disagreement over which Union general had actually authorized the mission. That ambiguity was never fully resolved in the official record. Jacob Parrott survived the war. After his exchange and the Washington ceremony, he returned to active service, was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1863 following the Battle of Stones River, and was promoted to first lieutenant in 1864. After the war, he returned to Ohio, settling in the town of Kenton, where he worked as a cabinet maker and later operated a stone quarry. He lived a long civilian life afterward, largely out of the public eye. On December 22, 1908, Parrott suffered a heart attack and died while walking home from the county courthouse in Kenton. He was buried in Grove Cemetery on the eastern edge of town, at a location that today sits at the corner of Ohio State Route 309 and a road that was later named in his honor, Jacob Parrott Boulevard. He is remembered today not because his individual battlefield actions were the most dramatic of the raid. Several of his fellow raiders faced worse, including execution, but because he holds by the simple sequence of a ceremony in 1863, the distinction of being first. That's the story of Jacob Parrott and of the 22 men who rode north with him from Big Shanty. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please like, comment, and subscribe for new episodes.